On today's Locked On Bucks, the team begins the 4-game road trip with a disappointing loss in Los Angeles, Inglewood to be exact. Camille and I dig into it and preview the next 3 games after this on Locked On Bucks.
You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into Locked On Bucks. I'm Justin Garcia, joined as always by Camille Davis. We thank you for making this your first listen of the day and for checking out and subscribing to the Locked On Bucks newsletter. If you have not done so yet, you can sign up for free at lockedondaily.com and get your day started with the all-new and free Locked On Bucks newsletter. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Super Bowl 59 is here, and there is no better way to make every play more exciting than with FanDuel Sportsbook. New customers can bet just $5, and if you win, you'll score $200 in bonus bets. Download the app or head to FanDuel.com to get started. Well, Camille, since we last spoke, the Bucks began their 4-game road trip. It started in Los Angeles. It looked really good for about 42 minutes, and then the wheels just kind of fell off.
Yeah, they started the game, and even with the game, it was a good game. 3 quarters in, just back and forth, some high-level basketball, seeing what Giannis was doing, seeing James Harden turn the clock back a little bit, so to say, seeing Kawhi out there, seeing Norm Powell. Like, it was an entertaining game 3 quarters into it, and then the 4th quarter came, and I felt like at that point, that was the crucial turning point. The Bucks offense started just turning the ball over consecutively. They got out of rhythm, and from that point on, they couldn't seem to keep up that offensive firepower to stay in the game because, yes, you can talk about perimeter defense being lacking with James Harden and Norm Powell going crazy. You can talk about Khris Middleton having a bad game because he did. Khris Middleton had arguably his worst game of the season here. Haven't seen one from him like that in quite some time, if I can even remember one. But all that being said, 4th quarter, they were still in the game. It was once they started turning the ball over and that offensive rhythm just started to deplete from them that the game was lost, in my opinion.
I think they had a stretch of 5 straight possessions that ended in a turnover. There was really 3-4 things that were most impactful in this game that I think stood out the most. The turnovers were a big piece of it. The Clippers do a good job of forcing turnovers, so you knew you got to be on guard there as the Clippers are winning with defense now. Offense is in the bottom 10, close to the bottom 5, but second best defense, and that's been consistent all year long. Bucks only had 4 turnovers in the first half, and I think they only surrendered 5 points off of those turnovers. It was the second half when 9 turnovers, 18 points off of them, and offensive rebounds for the Clippers. The Bucks have done such a good job on the defensive glass. And, when you point to the improvement the Bucks have made defensively, to me, it's really 2 things that stand out the most. Their defensive rebounding and getting back in transition. And the 2 of them are kind of tied together. They just didn't do it against the Clippers. And I do feel like it was a game where you miss Bobby Portis because that is one thing that he has consistently given you. And the Clippers just time and time again kept the possessions alive with 12 offensive rebounds. That led to 24 second chance points. That's the most the Bucks have given up this season. And it also helped them propel points in the paint where they dominated the Bucks 58-40.
And on top of that, too, the offensive rebound is a great point. I'm glad you brought that up because one thing those offensive rebounds help to do, as well as the Bucks turning the ball over so much, is that it gives the Clippers more possessions. Like the Clippers had 97 shot attempts overall. The Bucks had 79. And when the other team is getting that many more bites at the apple as well, it can be a bit difficult just to get enough stops and to keep your offense going the way it needs to in order to stay in the game. So some self-inflicted wounds in that sense of like, hey, box out, take care of the glass. And the Clippers, man, they're a small team. Like I was looking at some of the lineup, like, is Kawhi the center in some of these lineups that they had out there? And Kawhi's 6'7". So they had some small lineups. And without Bobby Portis being at the game because he's away for the team with personal reasons, do want to say if Bobby Portis is listening, hope all is well with you and the family. But without Bobby there, I thought 2 things. First, I was like, okay, they made Tyler Smith available. I was like, I would love to see Tyler Smith get like some minutes, not him coming in and taking Bobby's minutes, but we've seen at times where Doc likes to try to steal a few minutes, like end of the first, going to the second, where a guy gets maybe 5 minutes or so like that. We're going to steal some minutes here because our rotation's a little bit shorter. I was hoping to see Tyler Smith come out and get maybe 5-6 minutes or something like that, just to see how he looked at this point in the season. That didn't happen. But the other side to that was, because the Clippers play small, the Bucks could also play small, and not having Bobby, you don't have to necessarily try to always have the 2 big rotations. You'll be able to be out there and have, Giannis as your sole big, surround him by smaller guys, or even go the Brook route, which I thought Brook had an all right game. It's a little bit difficult when the team is smaller and they can space the floor out, and then he has to close the perimeter. That's not the way you want to utilize Brook Lopez. But with Giannis out there, when Zoo was the only other big out there, a lot of times that Zoo matchup seemed to give Giannis some problems, especially on the and just trying to box out, keep that body off the glass. So it was an interesting back and forth with the personnel matchups as well.
They were pulling in those moments, especially they were pulling Giannis away from the basket and then catching Zoo on the short roll, and he converted a couple of those. Brook did have 3 blocked shots when he was out there, and when they challenged him, he was effective. But to your point, these are the tougher matchups for not just Brook Lopez, but any of your traditional bigs. Just to wrap up the Tyler Smith piece, I wondered the same thing when we saw that he was activated. I mean, you also assumed it was breaking case of emergency, but you did wonder, okay, man, you really only have 2 bigs. Like, is he going to see some floor time tonight? And Doc said before the game, he's not going to fill Bobby's minutes. We just needed another body, but he does have an NBA shot. So that's one thing that he's worked on, and that really intrigues us. And as we sit here and record this Monday morning, Bobby Portis is out once again tonight against the Utah Jazz. And that's a Jazz team that isn't going to play small per se, with Lauri Markkanen's a 7-footer, Walker Kessler. They have bigs. So I do wonder if that answer changes a little bit for that matchup tonight against the Utah Jazz, but we'll get to that in just a second. But the other things that stood out, you touched on it. James Harden, like the Toby Keith song of "I ain't as good as I once was, but I'm good once as I ever was." That was watching James Harden, where, and I think during the broadcast too, Marcus was talking about it, and that, look, you can't lean on him for 48 minutes, but you can go to him for a quarter. He can heat up, and this is what he can do, where he's not the Houston James Harden, but in a vacuum, he gives you that glimpse of it. And that's what we saw for 24 minutes in that loss on Saturday night.
Yeah, because the second half, he really woke up, and it was watching James Harden take the shots that you've seen James Harden take for his whole career. And over the last few years, they don't go in at the same clip, but seeing them come in consistently was just like, gosh, it's like there was just the point of attack defense for the Bucks against the Clippers just wasn't there. Guys were able to really easily drive and kick, cause some confusion, make the Bucks get in scramble positions, and operate from there. Because as we mentioned, James Harden had a big game, 40 points for James Harden, 50% shooting from the field on that. It just didn't feel like he had to really work super hard for his buckets. Norm Powell also came alive, 33 points for him. So James Harden and Norm Powell alone, that's 73 of the Clippers' 127 points. Like the 2 of them, they just went crazy in this game, and the Bucks just didn't seem to have an answer. And in this game, it's another one where you're like, man, you wish you had AJ Green to kind of throw out there as well to see if he could do anything different. But I did also wonder if this was the game where maybe we should have saw a little bit more Andre Jackson Jr. just because they were having such trouble trying to stop these guys. Like, I know Andre had the 2 fouls quick, but there were a couple guys, Ryan Rollins, Khris Middleton, foul trouble early in this game, which also changes the flow a bit. But they just didn't seem to have any answers for James Harden and Norm Powell in this game, which I'm sure for Clippers fans was fun seeing them turn the clock back. But for Bucks fans, not as much fun. But I will say, I do enjoy whenever Giannis gets to play against the James Harden team, just because of all the history there between the 2 of them, going back to the MVP race and everything that came with that. But this time it just didn't go in the Bucks' favor.
One thing on that matchup that I want to touch on, a few other of the names in their containment or lack thereof of James Harden and Norm Powell too, in a very sobering thing that everybody has heard numerous times, but we'll revisit it in regards to Norm Powell. But as we move towards the rest of this road trip and what we've seen recently, I do want to take a look at some trends that we've noticed with some players on this Bucks team. So we'll get into that conversation coming up next on Locked On Bucks. Well, this next segment is brought to you by FanDuel. Super Bowl 59 is here. One game, two teams, endless possibilities. There's no better way to make every play more exciting than with FanDuel Sportsbook. Whether it's predicting the first touchdown, calling the MVP, or even betting on the coin toss, FanDuel makes it easy to get in on the action. With live betting all game long, you can adjust your bets as the game unfolds and feel the thrill from kickoff to the final whistle. The live betting feature lets you stay involved no matter what happens on the field, and the app is super easy to navigate. Plus, knowing that you can place a $5 bet and potentially win $200 in bonus bets for the Super Bowl is the icing on the cake. Download the app or head to FanDuel.com to get started. Just $5 betting that, and you'll win. You score $200 in bonus bets. So again, just a $5 winning bet scores you $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com. Bet with FanDuel, official partner of Super Bowl 59. Hard to believe, Camille, Super Bowl 59 already that we're here.
Yeah.
I'll withhold comments on the matchup that we have. It's not very enticing for most of us, but nonetheless, I didn't think Ryan Rollins had a good game on either end of the floor. Obviously, James Harden presents challenges on the defensive end of things. I thought Ryan Rollins, first time facing him, it's a learning experience, but offensively too, not a great game for Ryan Rollins where he didn't play within the flow. And that's really what stood out about him through the first start of this season, at least, just taking what's given to him. And I thought there were some forced possessions from him at a time where the Bucks really could not afford wasted possessions. But again, he's a young player and you're going to have these moments, but overall the body of work has been solid for Ryan Rollins. I do agree with the Andre Jackson Jr. point. Like at that point, when James Harden's doing what he was, 28 points, I think, in the second half, maybe it's time to see him. I don't think Doc really talked about that much in the postgame. I was just trying to look at my notes and I didn't see anything. But the one, it's like, well, you got to bring it up when you talk about Norman Powell, Camille, just seeing what our little boy has grown into.
Grievous Vasquez,
10th year in the league, first time as a starter. I think he's going to be an all-star this year. He's at least making a strong case for it. Career season. But, you mentioned the Grievous Vasquez part. It's even more sobering when you think that Norman Powell and the pick that became OG Anunoby for Grievous Vasquez.
Yep. It's one of those trades where you look back in retrospect. I mean, even in real time, quite a few people were like, wait, what? We're getting Vasquez. Okay. All right, fine.
I was one of them. One of them.
Where it's like, all right, this is the move. I don't understand it, but like, let's roll. And then we got nothing from him during his time here. And then you see Norm Powell cooking, you see OG, what he's become. So it's one of those what ifs that you look back on as a Bucks fan. It's like, this one hurts a little bit. But the Ryan Rollins point, I do want to talk about him for a second, and then also Khris Middleton, because we can't not talk about the game that Khris had in this one. But for Ryan Rollins, you mentioned like young guys go through these things, and that's part of it where it's like you got to kind of learn, because you tell young guys, hey, when it's there, attack it, go get it. And other times, like, play within the flow. So finding that balance of like, hey, we've seen Ryan Rollins go coast to coast, take the ball. Hey, I'm going. I got the break on everybody. Here I go, lay it up, bucket. But there were times in this game against the Clippers where it was like, this isn't the play. Like this situation, you need to slow it down.
You're contested at the rim. Let's kick it out.
Like there's too many bodies here. Pass the ball, bring it back out, do something different. But again, a bad game doesn't make a bad player. It was a bad Ryan Rollins game, but we've seen him be solid throughout. And Khris Middleton, a forgettable game for Khris. He picked up 2 fouls early. The second foul I thought was a really bad one for him, and he just never really got into a flow. He only attempted 4 shots from the field, didn't make not one shot. 4 personal fouls, no turnovers for Khris in this game, but also only 1 assist. It just, the flow of the game just did not seem like it was there for Khris. There were times he was getting beat off the dribble from Harden, and Harden is a guy who has lost the step. So when I was seeing him take Khris off the dribble, I was like, oh man, like it is not a good game for Khris here. But again, a bad game doesn't make a bad player, but you can see that Khris is still working through some things and really trying to get back to himself. And if there are people out there who have the question of, well, is there a route for him to get back to himself? I can understand having the question. And it's a question the Bucks are going to have to wrestle with as well over the next couple of weeks, because that is a name that we've been hearing in trade rumors, so on and so forth. And it's tough. It's tough. It was a bad Khris game. So I am looking to see if he does play tonight. I think he was questionable on the injury report going into this one against the Jazz. If he plays, just see what that bounce back looks like. The next time Khris Middleton steps on the court, I'm really looking to see what that bounce back looks like for him.
Yeah, it was a tough game for Khris. The second time this season that he was scoreless. You mentioned didn't look great defensively in this. And the tough part is he had put together a stretch where, I think early in the season you would hear people say, hey, Khris is really starting early in the season, early in his return. Mm-hmm. Hey, Khris is starting to round into form. I don't know if we were quite there yet, but it really did feel like we were there the last 5 or so games that he played in. When you look at the shooting splits, some of the assist numbers as well. And that's maybe at this point, ideally, Chris's best usage is like that Manu Ginobili type, where he's just out there to keep the offense moving and be another threat. And he was really thriving in that role, starting with that Magic win that the Bucks had, the first Magic win. But it was a tough game. And the second time this season, as I mentioned, he had been held scoreless. This one was more shot attempts. That the first one was the second or third game back.
I think it's the Magic.
Yeah, for Khris, ironically enough, against the Magic, a -16 too. And look, I've kind of preached this many times. I hate plus minus numbers because it doesn't really tell the whole story. It's who are you on the floor with? Who were you playing against? But it certainly matched the eye test for the Bucks. So you just look to get a stronger bounce back game, and that's the blip in a stretch of 10 or so games, because again, he was playing really well the previous 5 games here. And now it remains to be seen if we're going to see him tonight against the Utah Jazz. He was listed as questionable. I take that to mean he's not going to play tonight, and he's going to play tomorrow against the Trailblazers, because after all, Camille, Blazers game is much more important. They beat you in embarrassing fashion at home earlier this season. So that's the circled must-win game for this Bucks team. But yeah, it was a tough night, not just for Khris, for Ryan Rollins. We talked about every single player on the bench, save for Gary Trent Jr., who basically provided you all of your bench scoring with 19 points. You got to 21 in the final minute of the game. I think it was Tyler Smith that added the basket. But Gary Trent Jr. is what I want to transition to next here in some of the role players for the Bucks, the bench guys especially, and some of the trends that we have started to see fall into place with this group. I think it's one of the reasons why a lot of us remain very optimistic about this group, because of the fit of the roster and what we're seeing from that second unit, and perhaps most notably, Gary Trent Jr. So we'll get into that conversation coming up next on Locked On Bucks. Before we touch on some of these numbers, Camille, speaking of numbers, I think the thing that makes it tougher to swallow that you gave up 73 points to James Harden and Norman Powell, outscored Giannis and Dame, was this is James Harden's worst season of his career, by the numbers. Like, he's shooting below 40% for the first time in his career. All of the efficiency numbers have taken a huge tumble. His assist numbers are even down this season, scoring down to 22 points per game, basically. I know that's where he was the last season or so, season and a half in Philadelphia, but this feels very far removed from the guy that won MVP in 2018 and was still in the running the next 2 or so years. So that's the tough part of, all right, I guess he's got it every once in a while. And unfortunately, we were on the other end of James Harden having it. But speaking of guys that have had it consistently. Gary Trent Jr. And, you go back to the start of the season, the first 10 games, we've all poured through the numbers and mentioned, hey, look what the Bucks were doing shooting the ball. What stood out the most was you had AJ Green and Taurean Prince both shooting at or above 50%, and you were still one of the worst three-point shooting teams in the league. A big reason was the struggles of Bobby Portis. Damian Lillard wasn't quite as efficient at that point in the season. DeLon Wright, we weren't seeing much of anything from, especially offensively, but Gary Trent Jr. especially, the guy that you brought in and thought, this is our new Malik Beasley. Mm-hmm. Since he moved to the bench and really found and started to thrive in his role, you look at the efficiency numbers from Gary Trent Jr., and they have just continued to climb. His three-point shooting and field goal percentage have increased month over month over month so far this season. In January, he is shooting 54% from the field and 54% from three. He was a 45% shooter from three in the month of December. He was a 40+% shooter from three in November, and that was 10 games where he was coming off the bench. So the largest sample size. For whatever reason it is, his role as the reserve that has been that super sub that's giving you the scoring, he understands the role, and he has fitted perfectly for this Bucks team that he has found basically his place in terms of his efficiencies and getting that shot going. And, again, it's not a great comp because of the volume of games starting versus coming off the bench. But his point production is up as a bench player versus playing it. And look, you're playing with Giannis and Dame as a starter, but his point production is up. But his efficiency, he has doubled his field goal percentage and three-point percentage as a role player coming off the bench versus a starter.
Yeah, he's found his role. He's found his touch. And I think we should also bring up the fact that he was dealing with some back spasms early in the season as well at a certain point, which could have also contributed to the shooting touch just not being there for him, in addition to not being necessarily as comfortable in the role that he was initially slotted in as a starter. But coming off the bench, being able to be that guy like, hey, go get a bucket and play some defense, it seems to fit him really well. I'm glad that you brought up his shooting numbers because he's like a 39-40% career three-point shooter. So when the season began and we saw it just not falling for him, I didn't have any concerns. I know he's a better shooter than what we're saying, but the heater that he has been on over the last month or so, I wish I could bottle this up and find a way to guarantee that come playoff time, that production would still be there. But it's a long journey, and seeing how he's been able to really bounce back has been a really important part for this Bucks team. When I last talked to Frank, we were talking about the Bucks bench and how they've been putting up bigger numbers. A large part of that comes from the fact that Gary Trent Jr. has been playing the way that he has been playing. And again, once this team hits some injuries and then you start digging deeper into that rotation, the numbers look a little bit different. So against the Clippers, it was a lot of Gary Trent Jr. and nothing else, which I think made Khris Middleton's performance even more disappointing on a night where, you don't have AJ Green, you don't have Bobby Portis, so you're going to have to put on a bigger scoring load as well. So yeah, shout out to Gary Trent Jr. I hope he can continue to keep this rhythm going and just feel comfortable in that role and his understanding of what he's here to do, because he's been doing a fantastic job over the last few months.
The other guy that you talk about doing a fantastic job, and he's kind of been the inverse of Gary Trent Jr., has been Taurean Prince, that he's just become Mr. Reliable for this team. You know what to expect on the defensive end, and he's starting to hit shots again. I think when you look back at some of his numbers here, the move from the starting lineup to the bench really impacted Taurean Prince significantly. And Doc, talked about this at the time too, in that, look, when we signed him, the assumption was you're going to be coming off the bench. Khris Middleton is our starter. But as Doc Rivers said, don't listen to what these guys say. Every single player in the league thinks they should be and are a starting player in this league. And for Taurean Prince, why I say I think that impacted him more than most is we heard from day one at Media Day that he went through and made a point to look at all of the instances of catch and shoots on this team, not just last year, through the past couple of years with guys like Grayson Allen and Malik Beasley, you name it, of, all right, where are they spotted up? Where does Giannis like to find them? Where should I put myself to get some of those feeds from Giannis and really excel in a catch and shoot spot with his team? And it worked. You know, you look at, we mentioned the start that he was off to. He's shooting, 56% from three through the first 10 to 15 games of the season. Then Khris Middleton comes back in early December, and Taurean Prince is shifted to the bench. The reason why I think this really impacted him was, well, if you're thriving on catch and shoot opportunities, you're going to get a ton of those when you're on the floor with Giannis and Damian Lillard, and they're penetrating, the defense is collapsing, and you're out there in the corner open for three. It's not that you're not going to get those opportunities. You're just not going to get as much of those if you're coming off the bench and your minutes with Giannis and Dame are minimized. So you saw a little bit of a struggle there from Taurean Prince in those spots. And, you know, again, the numbers reflect that. His true shooting way down, 43% as a bench player, 36% field goal, only 24% on threes in those spots. So that's what's kind of stood out, is that his scoring has been consistent, whether he's a bench player or reserve. It's just his efficiency is what has really taken a tick upward now that he's back in the starting lineup. And I think just reliable and consistent, as much as I'm sure there's Lakers fans that will hear us saying this and say, well, actually, but he has just been reliable and consistent so far, especially back in that role as a starter. So much so, Camille, that I don't know, even if we start to see a prolonged stretch of, all right, Khris is back, it's still going to be tough for me to say, all right, let's disrupt all of this and let's, bring Taurean Prince off the bench again.
And I would agree with you on that, because I think for Taurean Prince, when you look at the numbers, just the raw numbers, as you were pointing out, you look at like the shot attempts when he was coming off the bench and when he was starting, they're not much different. He was still putting up about the same amount of shots. It's just that the shots that he gets as a starter, when it's Giannis and Dame out there in their gravity, they're better looks for him to be able to knock down, which I think helps the efficiency numbers for him. When it comes to Khris coming off the bench or TP starting, I think because if we can see Khris get back to some of the heights that we even saw earlier this season when he was just coming back from the injury, I don't necessarily think it's fair to say like, hey, we need you to play like you did in 2021, like asking him to do that's out of the impossibility. But I think that Khris coming off the bench at this point, one, it helps give a better balance to those bench lineups. I think Chris's game translates better where if he's a starter or he's coming off the bench, he can still find ways to contribute. And Taurean Prince, I feels like he's maximized if he's with the starters. Yeah. And I think with that understanding, there's the argument of saying, hey, if Khris comes back fully healthy, we see him playing the way we want him to play. There's no more minutes restriction. It's not as much game to game variance because of how he's feeling. I think it still makes sense for him to come off the bench, because with that, doesn't mean that he's not going to close the games with the Bucks. Doc Rivers could have the options to be able to figure out what's working in this particular game, and they continue to roll with it to get that victory. And come playoff time, we talked about it a lot. And with the playoffs, every series isn't going to be for everybody. Now, you would hope that every series is going to be for Dame, Giannis, and Khris, because those are your three highest paid players. So you want to see them perform. But the reality of it is, with Khris dealing with these injuries and not necessarily looking like Khris Middleton, as we've seen in years past, it's like, well, how can you best utilize this version of him if he continues to be on the team? And that bench role might be a really nice spot for him. Now, the Clippers game didn't offer any encouragement towards that with how he played, but what we've seen so far this season, other games from Khris, I think that's a big boom from him. And the playmaking in particular for Khris Middleton is a big piece of it, which is why this Clippers game was so disappointing for me, outside of him only, not getting any points, but one assist for Khris Middleton. Like that's not the game I'm looking forward to see from him. But I do think that rotation makes a lot of sense at this point, seeing how they've been playing and seeing how TP has been maximized with that starting lineup.
Yeah. Like we said, let's start to see Khris get back into that stretch, but I think the way that this team fit is another word we've used a lot with some of the moves in the offseason, the way the roster kind of flows together. I think it just fits like this, where you have a reliable bench. If Khris Middleton, what he's done as a playmaker and gets back to the scoring, Gary Trent Jr. and the consistency he's provided, Bobby Portis, that the Bucks, since Khris has made the shift back to the bench, are in the top 5, at least coming into the Clippers game, in their net rating from bench units. So it's something we've never really said in the past,
Yeah.
that, the Bucks benches were always we're going to give you a lead.
Don't lose
blow
it.
this, right? Don't lose this lead. So, yeah, that's one of the bigger questions that I have as we start to move into, we're officially in the second half, but the stretch drive of the season here. I do want to quickly touch on tonight's game, but I know it may be a bit annoying for the audio listeners, but just to get to some of the comments that we've had here on the live stream. Number one, a trade that our audience has built up during the course of this show and kicked around. It does not work for the Bucks. So you cannot trade Bobby Portis, Pat Connaughton, and DeLon Wright for Zach LaVine. It may work dollar for dollar, but the Bucks are over the apron. They need to get under the second apron in order to aggregate deals. So that trade cannot happen and will not happen. And the talk of they need to go acquire a third star. Well, I think the league is doing everything they can to make sure that does not happen. Not for the Bucks, for every team.
Everybody with the CBA, yeah.
Right. Like, look, you can have 2 stars. That's it. You're going to have to fill this out with role players and find guys that really succeed. And it's not just Zach LaVine. It's any of the names you hear that are making 40, 45, $50 million. Maybe you find a trade that works there, where with your limited assets, you can make that type of deal and ship off these pieces you don't want for one of those guys. But you're right back in the same spot next summer. Then, if that's what you're bringing in, a 45, let's say, $1 million contract, between Giannis, Damian Lillard, and the new player, you're at close to $160 million in salary. And the second apron line is $210 million, I think. So that's with 3 players too. You still got to round out the roster with 11 more players and have basically $40 million to do that and stay under the second apron. So good luck. So it's not about finding the star. It's about finding fit that works for this roster. And they've started to really develop that here. And that's, I'm not saying one way or another, make a trade or don't make a trade, but I think the even more complicated part of the trade deadline this winter versus last year is last year you felt like, we got to do something here. Like, we need help defensively. This just doesn't feel like we assumed it would with Giannis and Damian Lillard. I'm not saying it's 100% fixed, but this year feels like this is starting to make sense. And I like the makeup of this group. And that's going to be the challenge of, how much do you want to disrupt this for what may be a marginal upgrade?
Yeah, the 9-man rotation makes a lot more sense this year. The starting, we mentioned how Taurean Prince seems to thrive in that unit with Dame, Andre Jackson Jr., TP, Giannis, and Brooke. Off the bench, Bobby Portis, Gary Trent Jr., AJ Green, Khris Middleton. Like, that's your 9-man rotation. Ryan Rollins is like that 10th guy. If someone else is out, you're going to see some Ryan Rollins, or if you want to stretch the rotation, that's who you get. And that top 10, those top 10 guys, I feel pretty confident in, especially if everybody's healthy, getting down the stretch and being able to play some games and make some noise. The only roster upgrade that I keep throwing out there is, like, if they can add an athletic big into the mix, I would love that. I'm not here for, I see Colin Sexton's name coming up in the comments of this live stream. I don't think the Bucks need any more guard help in that sense. I think the area that the Bucks could use the most help is just having an athletic big to throw into that rotation for those matchups when, as we saw against the Clippers, teams that want to play smaller or want to play 5 out in situations where you don't necessarily want Brook Lopez to be that guy who has to close out to the perimeter. But there are going to be matchups when you need Brook Lopez as well. When you're playing the double bigs, when you're playing Cleveland, for example, a team that runs the double bigs, you're going to need that size, want that size. So I think this team's roster makes a lot more sense. They're 4th in the East after a really slow start to the year. And I think that, again, there's some things you can tinker with. And like you said, Justin, I think it's more about fit than anything else when it comes to how do you improve this team going forward.
And just to address a few others, Zach LaVine is not a marginal upgrade. Zach LaVine would be more than a marginal upgrade. Zach LaVine ain't happening for the reasons that we just mentioned. And, those 3 guys, that's $43.1 million with Khris, Pat Connaughton, and DeLon Wright. Zach LaVine makes just under $43.1 million. So the trade cannot happen there. You'd have to throw in other pieces. And again, then you're getting to the point of, all right, if we're doing a 4-for-1 trade, we have to sign at least 2 players to get back to the 14. you're signing them to minimums, but who's the fourth player and how close you're going to be to the second apron once you sign that fourth player or those two players. So that's why I think we need to shift our attention to smaller type of targets, to more role players in what you can do there because of the complications of having three, not massive, but large contracts. And what that means, if maybe you avoid the second apron this year, you're right back into it next year and afterwards, where we're talking about frozen picks in a time where those picks are probably going to be very valuable. When you get to 20, 31, 32 and down the road, most of this group is probably gone. If not all of this group is probably gone by the time we get to that.
One last comment here. I see Tony B asks Larry Nance Jr. That is one of those bigs where, like, I'd be perfectly happy if the Bucks could find a way to acquire Larry Nance Jr. And everybody's talking about Zach LaVine, but the bull that actually interests me is Jalen Smith, where it's like, if you could find a way to get Smith, that's an interesting one to me too. A younger big at that, who still has some development in front of him, but has shown he can be versatile, working on his 3-point shot. But guys like that, I think, are more in line of like the move I think the Bucks need to make at the trade deadline more than anything else, rather than getting in another highly, highly paid star.
Athletic big, I do think, maybe not Colin Sexton exactly, but to that point, I do think you still would love to have another guy that can handle pressure and a ball handler and somebody that can get things started there. But look, I'm sure we've got less than 2 weeks before the trade deadline. I'm sure we're going to have a couple of these live shows where, maybe we even do one of, all right, you're the GM, just throw it out there and we react to it. And we can go through the cap sheet too. And, well, this actually wouldn't fit, or this would fit. This one's interesting. So we'll get into things like that as we get closer and closer to the deadline. But again, we're 10 days away from the trade deadline now, Thursday, February 6th. Tonight in Utah, Bucks and the Jazz. Again, I don't think we'll see Khris. Bobby Portis has been ruled out once again, so maybe it's an opportunity for Tyler Smith. We'll see how the Bucks combat a bigger Jazz team than they faced in the Clippers. And then tomorrow, it's a TNT game, Camille. I'm not complaining with the Bucks getting national exposure, but we're really going with Dame and his return to Portland a year after the fact. Okay, that's interesting.
Got to get a win this time. Didn't get that win last time in Portland, so it's a chance to redo that right.
Well, we will have a post-game show either very late tonight or early tomorrow morning in the same format. The post-game show for the Blazers game is probably going to be Wednesday morning in another live show here to take your reaction to what we saw, so keep that in mind. And then you wrap up the road trip Friday night with Wemby and the San Antonio Spurs on the road. The last time the Bucks were in San Antonio, that was an instant classic between the Bucks and Spurs and Wemby and Giannis. And who knows, Camille, maybe we'll have another game, because we still haven't found out when that New Orleans Pelicans game is going to be made up. So stay on guard for that, as we could learn any day here when that game is being played and if the schedule this week gets tweaked and it's squeezed in this week. But that'll do it for today's show. For Camille, I'm Justin. We will talk to you guys once again tomorrow on Locked On Bucks.